All right. Um, I'm realizing I'm sharing the wrong PowerPoint. Give me one moment here. I had your slides up there, Cynthia, instead of my own. Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for our e-learning event today. We are joined by Dr. Cynthia Perdue and Cheyenne Gray Eyes for this Moving the Dial presentation today on building Indigenous community relationships. Here we go. So my name is Amanda Demmer. I am the program coordinator for Community-Based Research Canada. Community-Based Research Canada is situated on the traditional territory of the neutral Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee peoples. We are a membership-based organization whose mission is to advance community-based research excellence in Canada by strengthening community partnerships, building capacity, mobilizing knowledge, and championing community-based research among individuals, communities, and institutions. We are a social enterprise. We're funded by currently over about 50 institutional members. And as part of our programs, we host events like these webinar and live discussion events, as well as bi-monthly communities of practice. You can find more information on our upcoming events, as well as recordings of past webinars or infographics that we've created by visiting our website. And Sarah, CBRCanada's current student intern, is with me here today. Sarah can give everyone a wave. She'll be pasting some links in the chat for me, starting with the link for our website for anyone who would like to visit. I also want to just quickly acknowledge we have Steve Dooley with us today, one of CBRCanada's chairs, and I saw Lan Yan Chen signing on as well, who is coordinating these events, and Julia Coburn, my colleague and our CBRCanada administrative coordinator. So quite a lot of our team here today to say hello to you and join us for this webinar. As we get started, in the spirit of reconciliation, we open each e-learning event by reflecting on and amplifying the goals of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's call to action. This month, given the theme of the research project that we'll be hearing about from Cynthia and Cheyenne later, I decided to highlight call to action number 1, which states, we call upon the federal, provincial, territorial, and Aboriginal governments to commit to reducing the number of Aboriginal children in care. CBRCanada is committed to our continual reflection and growth on the interconnections between truth and reconciliation. And we approach the various topics using community-based research, engaging in and learning from Indigenous perspectives across Canada. Our agenda here today, we will have our webinar, of course, presented by Cynthia and Cheyenne. This webinar will be recorded. You'll see that our recording has started. The question and answer period attached to that will be recorded as well. This is where you'll have a chance to ask questions to Cheyenne and Cynthia about the presentation. After that, we will stop the recording and we'll get into our live discussion. So this is a really exciting portion of these events where we get the chance to turn our cameras on, to chat, to interact with one another, and to discuss some really interesting and critical questions about community-based research that Cynthia and Cheyenne have put together for us. So we encourage anyone who can stick around for the full 2 hours to join us for that live discussion. And then we will have a quick closing after that. The agenda for this event will be shared in the chat, and Sarah can share that with you now. So I'm very honored and pleased to be introducing our speakers today, Dr. Cynthia Perdue, who's an assistant professor in the Faculty of Health and Community Studies at MacEwan University, and Cheyenne Gray Eyes, who is a student research assistant at MacEwan University, as well as a youth worker at the Niginan Housing Ventures, which we will hear a little bit about during their presentation. So I'm now going to stop my screen share and I'll pass it over to our wonderful presenters to start their portion.
Thank you, Amanda, and thanks everybody for joining us. I'm just gonna get my screen going. Okay. Just have to move, you know, where the Zoom thing goes so that I don't get confused. Let's do that. Okay. So again, yeah, my name is Cynthia Pudu. I'm at MacEwan University, which is located in Treaty 6 territory. And we're really excited to talk to you about our project working with Niginan Housing Ventures and their Omamoo Wango Gamik housing initiative. You'll see our slides are not very, there's not a lot of words on them. There's a lot of photos, and you know, in working with Shannon, she'll tell you more about herself. Keeping it with our, the importance of trying to use Indigenous ways in our research. There's going to be a lot of oral histories and a lot of talking about the photos. And so a lot of what we're doing is just showing you the work through our photos and then letting you know about it through our words. So I'll let Cheyenne introduce herself, and then she's going to open with a smudge and a prayer as well.
Hello, everyone. My name is Cheyenne Gray Eyes. I'm from Muskeg Lake Cree Nation, and as already mentioned, I'm a student worker or a student research assistant under Cynthia and have been since 2019. And I'll be finishing up my degree here at MacEwan in a couple weeks, actually. I think next week I'll be done officially. So that's just a little bit about myself. I was raised in culture and ceremony here on Treaty 6 territory. And it was my Nochgompan Roxanne Tatusis that taught me how to start things in a good way. And so that's what we're going to do today. As she would have said, and I try to take off majority of my jewelry before I smudge. And in her way of knowing, it was you try to come how you were birthed into the world, and you weren't born with jewelry and all this other sort of stuff. I'm not going to take this off. It's a little bit too difficult to take off right now. But so with that, we'll just start with a smudge. As she would say, just pray in the way that is best to you, in whatever you believe in, whatever makes you feel good. Because that's what I'm doing basically. So. So the smudge is going now. I'll just. So I'm just, you know, as I pray and I smudge and I think about these things, I'm grateful for all the people that wanted to be here to participate in conversation with us, and that we will have a fantastic live discussion, and that people will be able to get what they need to get out of this webinar. And in like my way of smudging, it's always so that I see good things, I hear good things, I think good things, and I speak good things. And so that's the intention that I'm here today with you guys in the webinar. So appreciate your time, and yeah, can't wait to get into it. Hi.
Thank you, Shan. So just to give you an overview of what we're going to be doing today, we'll talk a bit, and I know we've spoken about this project through these webinars before, but many of you may not have heard it. So I'll tell you a little bit about the project. And, you know, because this is a community-based and Indigenous-led project, we always want to have our community partners represented. So normally I would also have our, she's now the former CEO, and we'll talk a little bit about her at these presentations, but because Shan was also involved in working with them, I feel that she was also a good representative of the community organization. So we'll talk a little bit about that. We'll talk about how we use Indigenous ways of knowing through our research, and how our research, we try as much as possible for it to be informed by Indigenous ways of knowing. And then we'll talk about how the research has evolved and how our collaboration has evolved a big part because of Shan's involvement and our ongoing conversations with our community partner, and how things have really changed in a few different ways to suit the needs of our community partner. So a little bit about Omamoo Wango Gamik and Niginan Housing Ventures. So Niginan Housing Ventures is an organization in Edmonton that their mission and goal, and Shan, you can fill in if I miss anything. Absolutely. Their mission and goal is to create culturally appropriate housing initiatives for Indigenous peoples in the Edmonton area. Their first building, Ambrose Place, was built to house the hardest to house in Edmonton. People who were suffering from severe addiction, had been chronically unhoused for many, many years, some even decades. And they provide permanent supportive housing for these people. And they've now grown into, I can't even keep track of how many. I think they've got 4, 5 buildings now.
I believe 4 in action, a couple, or 1 or 2 in the works.
Yeah.
But the idea is that houselessness requires several different needs, and not every person that experiences houselessness is exactly the same. Some people need different support levels, and so the tier system within Niginan kind of reflects that, and Omamoo being our most independent tier.
Yeah. So, and Omamoo Wango Gamik is a multi-generational, housing unit. And so when we say multi-generational, there are people literally from 0 to in their 80s or 90s. We
had babies being born in the space, actually, or like being brought home from the hospital, obviously, but yeah.
So so there's cookums and mushrooms, so the grandmothers and the grandfathers. There are live-in resident elders that are there to advise everyone. There are single parents with their young children. Here, I'll just move things along.
Yeah.
And a lot of the families that were there, they were children, families whose children were at risk of being apprehended. And we'll talk a little bit about, as we move into the project, the successes that are happening. So there were many moms that came there that were pregnant. They were flagged, or there was a birth alert. And because of the work that was done with the supports that they had, the women were able to keep their children. And a lot of people, such as this young man and several other families, got their kids back from care as well. So it's been really a great success story in terms of that. Also, young people that were aging out of care. The original intent, and this is sort of how things have evolved, was to follow the young people that were aging out of care. And there are a few young people, we would say between 18 and 26 to 30 that are there, some that were part of the foster care system. And some people have stayed there, some people had to move on for various reasons. Just like in lots of places, there are success stories, but sometimes there are situations that happen where some of the people had to move, and Niginan has tried to support them through those moves. There's also as I talked about, live-in elders. So these are some of the elders so Maggie and Ruth are currently living there, and some of the other elders that have supported the residents that are living there. So what we're doing with this project is we're basically documenting. It's kind of turned into a case study of, it started as a project to look at the experiences of young people aging out of care and their experiences in an Indigenous-led housing organization, but it's really turned into a larger case study, trying to understand the experiences of all the residents there, and a lot more now of the young parents that have been able to keep their children. And we're also talking to staff and things like that to get a better understanding of what's working and why this is a successful model for Indigenous peoples when it comes to housing.
Well, and if Carola were here, she would also say that our primary goal, or something that was often discussed in the space, was talking about limiting the exposure to child and family services. So we started with older youth who have already experienced child and family services, because the pipeline to homelessness for those people when they lose or age out. So while they might have government support 18, 19, 20, 21, you kind of are hitting that 22, 23, 24. If they have no parents or foster parents to lean back on, family members to lean back on, and they're losing funding and all these sorts of things. So, you know, poses a great threat for homelessness and also adjacent things like addiction, as they process things all by themselves without skill sets that they need. So, you know, it started there kind of at the back end after we, you know, these kids have already been through years in the system. But then it became a question of, well, how do we start limiting that exposure from the get-go? And that starts with the moms. And so you can start to see how the project got dialed back more as we started to look at younger and younger people and family units. And, you know, Corolla would really emphasize the community and how the community makes an impact on allowing those kids to come home, and also the successes of sobriety, you know, job and education for the youth and the young moms and young parents. So really that focus on community. So while we were focused on a very specific demographic in the beginning, it became very evident that it was the structure of the entire place, both the staff, both the live-in elders, and the people that were living there as well.
Yeah, and that, I mean, addresses the call to action of keeping Indigenous children out of care. And, you know, they've been very successful in doing that right now. So in talking about how Indigenous ways of knowing, and I have to stress, I'm not Indigenous. I'm an ally. I work with Indigenous, with this Indigenous community specifically, and I am learning every day. And it's an interesting thing of, I'm the professor and Shan is the research assistant, but I think I learn a lot more from Shan than Shan learns from me, especially about this. So I think that's an important part of that reciprocal relationship, both with our community partner, but I think with my research assistants as well. A typical research assistant professor relationship is very much, I'm going to tell you what to do and you do it for me. And
we have I hope
it's not like that.
No, we have a very collaborative relationship. Yeah. Like, obviously I learned a lot being a researcher, which is something that we're going to discuss today about a researcher wearing many hats, because my journey through this project started as a research assistant, very much on the back side of it. And then you can kind of see my journey inwards as I get closer and closer to the community partner, and having the space to be allowed to do that. So yeah, we're going to kind of go through what that looks like.
There. So, but you notice we started with the smudge, and that's something that we try and do at the beginning of all our meetings, whether they're online meetings or they're in person. You know, again, we're working there's Maggie again, and trying to work with the elders and knowledge keepers like Corolla. And what happened when we started the project, this would be 2019. We started talking about the project, and at one point we were looking at how we were going to document things and how things were going to happen. And finally, Corolla Cunningham, which I'll talk a little bit more about her, said, we need to stop and we need to start this project in a good way, because we hadn't started it in ceremony. And so Corolla invited us to her lodge, and we were able to have a pipe ceremony to start this process. As Corolla says, you know, universities have the research ethics boards, and the pipe ceremony for her community was the way to start this project in an ethical way, talking to ancestors and bringing that background into our project. So that's a big part of how we use Indigenous ways. And again, I try as much as I can to consult with them and to work with the community to make sure that we're doing things in a proper way. So that kind of brings us to how this research collaboration has evolved. So as I said, we started the project working with, I was lucky enough to meet Corolla, who was the CEO of Niginan Housing Ventures for 15, I don't know, for
I
a
don't
long
even know
time.
how long.
For a really long time.
Yeah.
And Pearl is an amazing advocate.
She's an absolute trailblazer in terms of like Indigenous housing. You know, I would even speculate in Western Canada, definitely, absolutely here in Edmonton.
Yeah. And she's actually been invited across Canada, all over the world, to talk about the work that she's done, not just in housing, but even in the justice system. And so I was fortunate enough to be friends with someone who ended up being one of her staff members. And in speaking with him, we just were talking about what are some of the things we can do together. And he introduced me to Corolla. And so the conversation began as, you know, Corolla's dream to have this type of housing unit that at the time when I first met her would have been 2018 or 2019, you know, wasn't built yet. It was just a dream. And so we talked about, well, what are some things we can do from a research perspective to get a better understanding of what that might look like. And then COVID happened. So that made life really interesting. But we continued our online meetings and our regular meetings. And the Omamoo Wango Gamik project actually opened in September 2020. So there was a small window of when we could kind of get together. But as you can imagine, from a community-based perspective, when COVID restrictions happened, it really made it difficult to not just grow the research collaboration, but from a community-based perspective in an Indigenous way that all involved relationship building, to build relationships, not just with the staff at Niginan, but with the residents. And so we tried a lot of different things. Through those COVID restrictions, we would have online meetings, and we tried to meet youth and residents through Zoom. And
which wasn't super successful.
No,
might I add.
No.
That's okay. I mean, it's just, it wasn't geared towards what was necessary. It just felt a little bit awkward. And so we just kind of pushed forward in the other ways that we could kind of push forward.
So, but what I will say is, I don't think our relationship with the community partner grew until we were able to bring along and both the research assistants. So this is Selena Baypond and Shan, who's here with us. And we brought them on from the very beginning, but it was through our connections with the building that Shan and Selena started to spend time there. Because if you want to do a good community project and a project with Indigenous community specifically, that relationship building is essential. And again, building relationships through Zoom is tough, especially with a lot of the young people. You know, we assume that all young people are into digital technologies, and a lot of people there really weren't.
And there was a big hindrance of even having access to tech that could run like a Zoom software. You know, many of them were working off of cheap phones or whatever they could afford. I know when I came on, there were youth with flip phones still, and not that that's a bad thing, they were making it work, but it is not cohesive to a good Zoom meeting. And so there were even tech kind of things like that we were running into. Yeah, so what happened was they started spending a lot of time there. And through that, it was sort of a traditional RA role. They were doing literature reviews and things like that. But for us, it was also an important thing for our research assistants to be part of that community engagement, right? To get a better understanding of the importance of building community and getting to know people before you do research with them. And what happened was through that, Cheyenne's role evolved both as a research assistant, but then became a staff member. So I'll have Cheyenne talk a little bit about her journey of research assistants to staff and back. So like Cynthia mentioned, I started as a research assistant back in 2019. And then my research assistant role kind of evolved that we were trying to create small amounts of programming sort of regularly. Both me and Selena were full-time students. She's now finished and I'm finishing. And so, you know, working around both our busy schedules is very interesting, but we tried to get on the ground with programming as best we could. And then later that year, last summer, I moved over doing youth work at Omamoo Wango Gamik. So I was running programming and housing for give or take about 6, 7, sometimes 8 different youth. But being on site there, not only did my job role kind of expand out from our original age category of 18 to just below 30, I was then starting to interact with the younger kids that were also starting to come out of care. So you can see me here. This is with one of the tenants' kids. And I added this to really highlight that as a staff member, you are intrinsically tied into the community as an auntie or an extension of family, someone to be trusted. So you have to take that very seriously, and there are ethical things that you have to consider as you're helping people through very serious issues like trauma and addiction, and but also trying to facilitate fun. So I kind of broke my programming down into 3 different ways, cultural and ceremony ways, which obviously we've kind of put forward the emphasis that's already there. And that was a big emphasis in the building at the time is, you reconnect the youth to culture and ceremony, and they'll be able to find a sense of who they are. And my other thing was life skills. Everyone should know how to do their taxes. You need a driver's license. We should be able to get that done. Practical things. Learn how to pay your bills on time, those kinds of stuff. But the aspect that I really had a lot of fun with was inner child work. So this was my other youth worker that got hired about halfway through the summer, Des. He was really fantastic. Was a little bit younger than me, so he was able, he had a good relationship with some of the younger youth. This is us at a bouncy trampoline place. I found it really important that, these youth that come in often come out of very serious situations, and they've had to act as adults most of their life when they were not adults and did not have the capacity to make adult-like decisions, yet they were making adult decisions for themselves. And to bring a bit of that childhood that they had missed, potentially being in child and family services or being on the streets and growing up too quickly. And so, I put a real big emphasis on trying to get these childlike things back. And so this next slide was a trip that we planned down south. The kids were very excited for. This was our time at Blackfoot Crossing. I felt it was important to, I had one Blackfoot youth as well as a mixed Blackfoot person, and obviously we're in Cree territory, and so I thought it would be really important to be able to give them a little bit of rooting in their specific cultural background. So we went south. And this is some of the youth that I took with me. So some of us, that's me there on the left, or the middle left, yeah. And then one of our older youths, and then those 3 are a little bit younger. They had a fantastic time, and this is getting them to kind of connect with the land. This here is them working with an elder at Head Smashed In Buffalo Jump. They really got a lot out of this. This was fantastic to see, really watching them get pulled in. And as soon as I hit the ground down in Blackfoot territory, we were standing to the front of Head Smashed In Buffalo Jump, and an elder came up to us, and he said, "Oh, I want to pull you into a room and you can have a private teaching with some elders and a buffalo runner." So it was really fantastic. The kids really got to see what it was like for other adults to care about their cultural education and be invested in them, even though they had never met them, and really solidify the idea that the community takes care of our kids and that we want to make a difference in their lives. And this is just one way that we wanted to do that. And this is them at the site of Head Smashed In Buffalo Jump. We're all squinting. It's very bright and it was very hot, but they had a really good time. And since it was so hot, we ended up taking them to Waterton Park. That's this next slide right here. This was a surprise for them. They were, so many of them had never even been to the mountains, and I just wanted to give them a piece of what it was like to be a normal kid. I know for me, I went to the mountains pretty regularly. My parents, we would just drive out and go for a hike, and as Indigenous people, we get into these spaces for free. Well, it's our land and our territory, so, it's a little, but at the same time, so many of them wouldn't even have had the opportunity to go out that way, especially as far south as Waterton. And so this just felt like a really special and important surprise to be able to give to them. And so all these types of programming became just a way to facilitate trust and community building with not only the younger kids, but also their parents as well. Like I had youth with me on this trip as young as 12. And to me, that's a big marker of the trust between myself and the parents, that they know that I'm going to take care of their kids in a good way, and that their kids are going to have the best time possible. And that it's a worthwhile experience for them to go, and that they didn't have to pay anything either. They didn't have to feel the burden of sending their kids on a trip like this and saving up for ages. Instead, they could focus on things that were more important. And hopefully, like, this was a trip that the kids really remember. And I've gone back a couple times since I went back to school. I didn't stay on as a youth worker, so I'm no longer a youth worker at Omamoo, but I do go and visit sometimes, and the kids still talk about this trip. They really love this. And I've even had parents email me after the fact and just talk about how influential this trip was for their kids. I think it made them feel seen. And that was a really important part of programming in both a cultural way and, an inner child type work and programming. So
I'm going to talk a bit about how this has really helped the research project. As an outside researcher, you can spend as much, like, all the time you want to try and build relationships, to get to know people, to spend time there, but it's never the same as being on the ground and being part of the community. And so I think what happened was, as Shan became a staff member and started to work really closely with these families, she became part of the community. I think I would argue to say is still part of that community.
Yeah, definitely.
And so what that has done is it has really grown that trust relationship. And it really wasn't until Shan was working closely that we were able to start interviews. I'm pretty sure our first interview happened right around the time, she started as a staff member. And even though she's now not there every day, she has that relationship. And so it's a lot easier for us to get those connections, for the young people to trust us. And, as it's an interesting thing, I talk with Shan about some of the research, and she's, she knows so much about the young people, and when I interview them, I don't get as much because they don't know me as well. And so that's led to an interesting dynamic of Cheyenne's wearing the different hats of research assistant and youth worker. And so what happened when Cheyenne became a staff member, as a research team, we said, okay, you're now working there and you're able to facilitate relationships and those kinds of things. But now, as a research assistant, we're going to pull you back from interviews, reading transcripts, anything like that. From an ethical perspective, we felt that it was important that she can still do literature reviews and all those kinds of fun things for us. But in terms of diving into the data and looking at those things, because she has such a trusting relationship, we felt that it was important for her now to step away from that part of the research project in order to ensure the confidentiality and things for the staff. So it's been an interesting balance, I think, and maybe you can talk about, I don't know if it's been a struggle but what it's been like for you.
It's definitely, wearing those different hats were definitely interesting. Every space that I walked into, I'd be like, okay, how do I need to play this role so specifically that it's not encroaching on anyone else? Because if I'm sitting in the room asking the questions for, interviews and this sort of stuff, which, don't get me wrong, I would love to do. However, they might say something that they would only say to me in confidence, because that was the type of relationship that we had previously. So we run the risk of that kind of marring exactly what they want to say and what they want represented in the research. And it's important, especially as these individuals have been through a lot of trauma, that we absolutely respect their autonomy and make sure that they're fully informed in every decision that they make. And so me taking a step back from a very, what would be understood as a very academic or Western form of research, I don't really exist in right now. And I can't really with this project. And it's a trade-off that you just have to be willing to make. If you want this type of community building and you want this type of trust facilitation, this is just a trade-off, and a trade-off that in my eyes was completely positive. I don't think any data or any interview would be as good as the feedback that I got from the kids when I left that space. And the growth that I saw them do and the confidence that I watched them build. That to me is the whole point of this research, is building community, not just recording the building of community, but you have to be a part of it. You have to be tied up in it, because that's the whole point of community. And obviously not everyone on our research team could do that, or else we would never get any data. So, you know, it's a very specific role for someone to play. And I thought it was just a fantastic way of going about it. I know that how we have conducted my research and how Cynthia has let me kind of wear these different hats does impact our research. And to some people, they might see it as impacting the research negatively. You know, we won't get as much data. Oh, you don't have as many research assistants working on your stuff. But at the end of the day, the positive outcomes weighed out anything else that we would have gotten from the research if I hadn't done this. And
yeah, well, we're talking about building community, building Indigenous community. I think that helps, that help builds our relationship. You know, and for me, the reason I do research, and I hope that the reason why a lot of people do community-based research is to help the community. And I do think it's at the expense of growing our research programs. And for me, again, that's not in a negative way, but if you are, and we'll talk, that's sort of some of the questions that we'll have later on, is if you're, you know, in a university system that is really about publishing and publish or perish, I do find that this type of community research can be difficult because of the time it takes, and because of the importance of doing things in a respectful way. You can't publish as much. And to me, that's okay, because the point of our research is doing this. And
our top concern isn't data collection.
Yeah,
it's impacting people's lives positively. And so as researchers, you know, you got to put your own academic desires behind the people that actually need help, because a project like this, if recorded properly and done correctly, can be shared to different communities and can be facilitated again and again. And that's the point. That's the point. Not that we get uplifted as researchers, oh, like we have this fantastic idea, you know, and we went about it in a certain way, and we get all the applause for being the researcher in that way, and then we write fantastic papers that, you know, the notoriety that comes with doing research like this. If that's your concern, well, then you're not going to get very far in the community. And so putting that aside quickly allowed for good community trust and community building. And Krola was the one that came to us as researchers and was like, I don't want to just record the successes. This building has to be recorded from the get-go, because to be able to do this correctly, it can't just be, oh, everything that we did correctly. It has to be all the hiccups, has to be all the bumps, so that people, you know, if this were ever replicated, that they can actually use that data properly. And so the mindset's completely different. You're not just recording successes, and you're not doing it for yourself. You're doing it for community and around community.
And I think that's where you can get the synergy between what you need for, like, from a research perspective and the community, because part of what we're doing as researchers is documenting that. And what we write, while yes, it helps build our research programs, if we write with the intent also to help communicate what this project is doing, and how it's worked, and to share with other groups, then hopefully you know, we can build more places like this, and maybe people who haven't heard about Niginan can talk to them and learn about them as well. So I think we're at time. I don't know if we're over or under, but I think hopefully we've given you enough information about the project and how we've done our research, and we're really happy to answer any questions, and then have some discussion about colonial practices and how they make this research difficult.
Yeah, so, essentially.
I will stop my slide. There we go.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Cynthia, Cheyenne. It's fascinating to hear how you've negotiated all these multiple tensions in your research projects, kind of the tension between the institutional pressures of research versus the community desires out of the research, and the tensions in your role, Cheyenne, as well, between research assistant and worker. So thank you for sharing this with us, and the way that you were able to really build community within this research project, and even kind of prioritize that community building within the research project. So we have a chance now. We have about 20 minutes for questions and answers. So if you do have a question, please post it in the chat. I see that there's one question posted already, so I'll start there. And please share your questions if you have them, and hopefully we have time to get to any that come up. So the first question that was in the chat here comes from Aylin. What steps or tips would you recommend for non-Indigenous academics that want to begin the community outreach and engagement in Treaty 6 and 7?
Getting to know people. Because a lot of people are like, oh, this sounds interesting. I want to work with Indigenous communities. And you have to know someone to get to know the Indigenous community. You can't just show up and say, hey, how's it going? You know, it was through previous work that I met someone who then was working at Niginan, and that's how that relationship started. And so if you don't know anyone, you know, if you're at an academic institution, you know, if you're talking Treaty 6, that, you know, got MacEwan, U of A, there are elders that consult those institutions, talk to them, and then start to get an understanding and start to meet people. And you need to give yourself time. It can take years to build these relationships, and I'll let Cheyenne talk more from her end.
I would say hire Indigenous people on your team. I mean, that's really, really key. Because it otherwise you're walking the line of what has been an issue in traditional research and anthropology and these kinds of things, of looking in on a culture that is not yours without perspectives with you sitting behind the lens as well. It's one thing to look at something and try to interpret it in a good way and, you know, use it for a good way. However, having checks and balances naturally in your systems of research is really important. You know, there have been times in meetings where me and Cynthia are talking about stuff and I go, whoa, 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 yeah, no, that doesn't line up. No, if you said that to the community partner, it would, you know, and it's not that bad. I mean, Cynthia knows what she's about and she's done this for a while, right? But, you know, every once in a while, there'll be something that it's like, oh, that doesn't sit right with me, that won't get clocked by someone who is non-Indigenous. And that's how you run into those issues of like, are you just an unwanted observer? Which is something that Indigenous people feel very real about when it comes to white people. Well, particularly white people, because that's how we have seen research being conducted over academia forever. I don't know. You know, that it's really important. Yeah, have Indigenous people on your team. Make sure that your perspectives are coming from both ends. Research a lot about Indigenous methodology and make sure that you're falling within them constantly. Work with Indigenous people that actually want you to work with them. That's a big one. There are lots of Indigenous organizations and people that need funding and need validation from the academic end of things, and they're struggling to get that validation. And so if you can serve that and be helpful and uplift your community partners and put them first, just set your intentions in a good way and try to move forward. And like Cynthia said, you know, it might not be quick, but it'll come when it needs to come. In an Indigenous Ways of Knowing is you'll be exactly where you need to be when you need to be there. So if you weren't meant to do this work, well, then it'll just take a really long time and you might struggle uphill for a really long time, and it might just be not meant for where you were meant to be. But if you land on a community partner that wants your help, that wants facilitation, that you can help uplift, I'd say run with it and go with it. Yeah.
The hiring, so everyone we hired as research assistants is Indigenous. And that was important. And, you know, the one point, even in preparing these slides, there were some photos I had and Shan was like, oh, no, he can't put that. He can't share that. It was a ceremonial space. I was like, oh, I didn't even know, right? So that's, you know, where I keep learning from them. So.
Yeah, and never forget that no matter just on Treaty 6, there is no pan-Indigeneity, even between different spaces. You know, those pictures might have been okay for somebody else to present, but since it was coming from me, I was like, no, please take those off. So it's always a recognition of Indigenous peoples as individuals and also as collectives, and try not to fall into that hole where, you know, we're all the same, and know that people are going to have different opinions about different things, and that'll really help inform working with Indigenous peoples. Definitely. Yeah. And always ask questions.
never be afraid to ask questions. Yeah.
Mhm. Thank you. This is really helpful. I think it really beautifully illustrates two of the hallmarks when we talk about community-based research. We talk about the importance of community-driven research and of participatory research. And the way you answered that question, you kind of, I think, highlighted both of those, the importance of getting invited in or having research partners that want you to work with them, having that community-driven aspect to the work, and also having that participatory aspect of bringing in the Indigenous research assistants and doing that research in a really collaborative way, and having those kind of checks and balances in place because of the participatory approach you're taking to research. So thank you. I am going to pass it to Steve, our CBRCanada chair, who has a question.
Oh, thank you very much. I'm coming to you from White Rock, British Columbia, which is on the unceded territory of the Omamoo First Nation. Just wanted to acknowledge that. And wow, that was just an amazing presentation. And Cheyenne, that photo of you with the child that you're hugging, you're the RA auntie. It's so
yeah. That's exactly
RA auntie.
It's
so true. But I wondered if you could both unpack a little bit for me, because what I see in you is this real authentic relationship, and that's actually my favorite word, is authentic. How do we know when this work is really authentic?
Yeah.
And maybe unpack your relationship a little bit more, because kind of thinking about the context of being a professor, I think about the positionality of that and the quote unquote power versus the RA. How are you able to create that great authentic relationship within that dynamic of kind of, and sorry, the phone's ringing right now. Sorry about that.
We can't hear it. It's good.
I think I may have told both my RAs, I don't think I should ever be a manager of people because I'm very good at it. I don't like telling people what to do and all these kinds of things. For me, it's about, I have so much to learn, and I have so much to learn, and they have so much to teach me. And so I think for me, it's part of that. It's almost,
Can I?
I'm just, because I think, I don't think I feel like, not that sometimes because I think I saw a question that's like, we're asking ourselves, why do we want to work with Indigenous communities? And as when I was really young, I met an elder in Ganawage near Montreal, and I was really touched by my experience with this person, and it was ever since then I always wanted to learn more about it, and I just found myself lucky enough, I taught at an Indigenous college for a while here, and then I just found myself in situations where I was working with Indigenous peoples, not because I sought it out, but when you work in homeless research, that happens, right? And so I just found myself lucky enough to be around Indigenous peoples and really enjoy what I've learned. And so for me, it's always about, I am so concerned about, I don't know enough and I don't want to make mistakes, that I'm always asking questions. And so and it's interesting because Shan was actually in even one of my classes. She was actually not just an RA, but my student. And so I just tried to find a way. It's, at some point, I think I had to pull the teacher card at one point, because it's like, you got to hand in your assignment. But come on. But I think I just see this as a mutual reciprocal relationship as opposed to a professor, even though I guess I pay her, but
yeah, which is nice. I mean, it's always good to pay Indigenous people for their knowledge and work. And I think like the part of it, or at least part of the relationship, I think is that my knowledge and my cultural, my knowledge is not grounded in academia, primarily. Which is something like when you hire Indigenous people who are part of community, that will be a theme, is we have struggled for years to be validated on our oral history and knowledge, and the teachings that we share in community constantly, because it really informs my worldview. And so that's a big part of our dynamic in our relationship, is that she has knowledge that I have not even had a chance to touch, just from years of being in academia and working in research and all this sort of stuff. but I have been a community member and I have been a knowledge, adjacent to a knowledge keeper for many years now. And, not to speak too highly of myself, but I try to listen every chance I get. And I'm constantly absorbing, my cultural and ceremonial knowledge to bring back and to give it to people who need it to impact their lives. And so I think that's a really big part of our relationship. That's where that inherent respect comes from of equals, is because we both have a vast set of knowledge that is so different from one another that we don't really hit those power plays necessarily. Like, yeah, we had that one little thing with a student thing, but I was kind of, I needed an extension. No, I'm kidding. Sometimes sometimes you're a student, sometimes you're a research assistant, sometimes you're the expert. I have walked into meetings where, I'm often in meetings with Cynthia where she absolutely treats me like the expert. All of the time. That's not really something in question. So that's where that space of equality automatically comes in and makes it so that we're always talking to each other on an even playing field, absolutely all the time. And we started this space and ceremony, and that's that's what ceremony is all about, that we all sit together as equals with different knowledge sets to come together and to create a comprehensive perspective on how to help people. And so, and I mean, I was even lucky enough that through this research, we haven't even talked about this, but I actually got published last December. And I was still deep in my undergrad and all this kind of stuff. And I got published through the Radical Housing Journal. And, it was Cynthia that kind of pushed me to be like, you're absolutely capable enough to do this and to put your work out there and to write something. And so, we have a completely, I would say, equal balance of relationship, especially between just acknowledge and respect of one another and what we both bring to the table.
And I think so.
Sorry, I want to, there's so many people in the chat that have questions. I want to make sure. I don't have too much space. So
I just want to say though, I while I have been in academia for a while, I actually didn't get back into research until maybe like 7 or 8 years ago. And so I came to it as a much older adult. And and even in talking with Corolla from Niginan, she said, you do it differently. And I think it's because I hadn't done research in so long, and I sort of lost what traditional colonial research looks like and just jumped into community-based research. And for me, it really helped to treat not just my RAs as experts, but my community partners as the experts in the room, as opposed to me.
Thank you. Over to you, Amanda. Thank you so much. It was great to go.
Thank you so much. It's a great answer to those questions. And Cynthia, I like that piece you added in there. I think sometimes it's important for academics to step away from academia and come back with a fresh set or a different set of eyes, new perspectives when they've been away from research. So we do have, I think, 3 more questions in the chat. So the first one that came in was, I was wondering if you have encountered children or adolescents who have accessed care from Jordan's principle, and if so, how are they supported when they age out of that funding?
Yeah, I have. It's actually more something, okay, rewind a bit. It's more so that when youth kind of hit our building, or particularly when I was working there, was just the lack of awareness of what they actually could get funding for, what they actually could get help for. So while it was often something that we did on site with them afterwards, just kind of assessing their needs and trying to pull something together. We didn't work with Jordan Principle a whole lot, just because majority of what we were falling under was things like housing funding, AISH funding, those kinds of things kind of took precedent and were more important. I would say the Jordan's Principle would have been something that a different staff member would have dealt with a little bit more directly. I was more pushing for what's that called? Oh, I'm blanking. Like housing accommodation, housing subsidies, and those kinds of things were a little bit more important. So sorry, I don't think I can answer that question fully for you. However, I don't know.
That's it's something we would. That's a staff thing, right? So again, this is where we learn, right? I learned from her because those are things that I wasn't involved with. So.
Yeah. So sorry, I can't answer your question fully. I do know that it was something that, would get reached out to. It's just quite a long process, and I had quite a few youth under my team, and my job was quite fast paced just because of how focused I was on programming. So oftentimes when things like that would happen, I would pass off that role to a more senior member who was a lot more paperwork oriented, and, you know, kind of had their head in the desk all day long, making sure these things were sorted out properly. I was more frequently someone who was in the field, taking care of kids, driving people around, doing programming, those types of things. Yeah.
Okay. So 2 more questions left, and I'm going to, you'd mentioned, Cynthia, the one that asked about, you know, why do we work with Indigenous communities, and shouldn't we ask ourselves that? I'm going to kind of come back to that question last, because I think it'll be a good segue into the discussion questions you have for us. So first I'll go to this other question. Someone has asked, do you have recommendations on funding models or approaches that ensure community members participating in research are compensated properly and do not incur expenses as a result of their participation?
I'm not sure about funding models. I think, let's say if as an academic, you are writing grants for research funding, that you absolutely need to budget into your or put into your budget that compensation and fair compensation, right?
Yeah.
What is a fair compensation for community member, and depending on the community members. So, you know, not necessarily this group, but when in previous research, I was working with some people that were chronically unhoused. And so how do you compensate them? Well, a gift card, which from a university perspective is really easy to give because you can track and all those kinds of things, doesn't always work, and actually is a barrier for some community members. Because what if the gift card doesn't work? Or what if they enter the place where they use the gift card, and because of how they look, they're going to get targeted and kicked out and those kinds of things. So cash compensation, I think, is often a better compensation, which luckily our institution allows for that, and allows for that for research. But I do know that it was an uphill battle to get that cash compensation for research participants. And so, yeah, understanding what is a fair compensation for that. And when you're involving them with, so for example, even not with this project, but we've got a small conference happening here at my university, and we're trying to invite community members, and I've been pushing for compensation for community members, right? Even though we're inviting them to come and present, we still have to compensate them for their time. And so I don't know about specific funding models, but I think if you are applying for a grant, make sure that you are budgeting for that fair compensation, and you need to advise with the community what is fair compensation. So there's compensation for your research participants, but if that participant is an elder, that's a different compensation than it is for another community member. Or if you have an elder advising you, what compensation that. And again, the rules set out by universities make that really complicated, because some elders, if you're inviting them more than once, you're incurring a certain amount of cost, and now CRA is in the, Community Revenue Agency is in their picture, and now you've got to get SINs and all that kind of, right? So that really complicates things. And so these are conversations that you then have to have with your university administration on how are you going to do this. One thing that, we were lucky, we got some excellent funding from making the shift. And what we also included in that funding was compensation so that we could help the community partner get a youth worker. So we were able to get a funding agreement where some of our research funding actually went to Niginan, and they were able to use it to hire other youth workers and things like that. So that's another thing, is depending on the funding that you have, can you have that as well, so that your research, so then the best thing about that is when you transfer to the community partner, now the community partner has the funds and they can disperse them however is necessary. And that makes life a lot easier than having to track through university system. So those are some tricks I would suggest, is if you're working with a community partner and you're getting any sort of funding, especially if it's tri-council, trying to see if you are eligible to transfer funds to your community partner, because that makes life way easier when they have the money, and then they can buy whatever, right? Way easier to deal with that.
And in Indigenous kind of methodology, like how we would kind of talk about that is through forms of honorarium, right? That keyword, especially if you're working with an Indigenous people, you'll hear elders talk about honorarium. But it's really the idea that people are being compensated adequately, not only for their time and not only for their travel, but also for their depth of knowledge. That's really important, right? Especially when talking and working with elders and other community members. We treat oral history as something that is contained within the person. And so, you know, and I just saw a comment, elders are the PhD holders of our community, is absolutely, absolutely correct, right? Is we want to honor them with their lived experience, their entire their life long learning through forms of honorarium. And so taking that very seriously when you call an elder to the front, but not only just elders, right? Honoring a younger person with something like honorarium. I know when I'm giving honorarium, something like that, I treat it real seriously because I understand where they're coming at it with. They're saying, I acknowledge you as someone who is bringing knowledge to the table that I would not have otherwise, that I couldn't have read in a book, that I couldn't have researched, and you're bringing it in a storytelling kind of way, in kindness in your heart and good intention. That's a big element of respect. So not only are we talking about money and talking about funding and compensation, we're talking about respect, and relationship. That's what we're talking about at the end of the day. So while it is complicated and while money gets in the way and the colonial institutions and the colonial standards, which is something that we pull into our questions of the hindrances, the potential hindrances within colonial institutions when it comes to working properly with Indigenous community members. So not only do we have like a fantastic example of like, okay, well, what are the practical ways to get people paid properly? How do we actually get money to our community partners? How are people literally being compensated? But then it's also the methodology and the intent and the idea behind the compensation itself. So yeah.
And then understanding, especially when working with elders and knowledge keepers, what are the protocol practices, right?
Yeah,
and
that's
always the conversation.
Are you bringing tobacco? Are you bringing gifts? Are you bringing prints? All those types of things. And if you bring that to someone, you know, they'll honor that relationship. And, you know, that gift is reciprocal. If you only want to bring a $30 gift, well, they're going to give you $30 of information. You want to bring them a $300 gift, they're going to give you $300 of information. It depends elder to elder, but what you bring to the table is a direct representation of what you want to get from that person. Because they are the PhDs of our community. They are the books. They are the encyclopedias. They are where the knowledge sits. If you want to learn about it and learn about it properly, you got to bring something to the table that actually represents how long they have been struggling to keep these things alive. Because it's not just that, oh, you know, they've spent their whole life learning. Well, if that person is 75 years old, say like my cookum, she's been to residential school. She's struggled her way through university. She's struggled to be validated in spaces. We're not just looking at an elder right now who's now being validated for their knowledge. We're looking at an elder who has spent their entire life fighting for their knowledge to stay alive. So going in with that intent and that understanding will really inform how you pay people, how you compensate people, and really the gravity that you're putting behind that honorarium. That I think people kind of gets lost sometimes. So yeah.
Mm-hmm. That's such great emphasis to bring in that. I think we don't always think about what all is entailed when we offer folks honorariums and in this context. So thank you. That's very, I think, helpful knowledge and lots of, you know, agreement in the chat and folks saying they really appreciate what you've shared as well. So I'm going to move us forward. The final question that was in the chat here was about indigenizing research, which I think will lead us very well into our discussion. So just to share the question that was asked, someone had asked, should we not be encouraging each other to ask why we might want to work with Indigenous communities? And if that's the case, and shouldn't we decolonize or indigenize all research through all disciplines if it's happening on Turtle Island? So what are thoughts about indigenizing research as a universal design strategy? So let's put a pin in that because I think that is very closely linked to one of the questions, yes, that we're asking back to folks. Yeah. So before we move on to the live discussion, just acknowledging that some folks might have to get going, might not be able to stick around. So if you are heading out now, unfortunately, you'll miss that very engaging conversation we're about to have about Indigenous research designs, but we would love to stay in touch with you. So please feel free to sign up for our e-newsletter to hear about upcoming events, future webinars, live events like this. And Sarah can share the link for our newsletter sign up in the chat with you now. So again, thank you to our presenters for that wonderful presentation. Thank you to everyone who asked a question and anyone who might be watching this recording. I am going to end the recording now, and then we will pass the microphone to all of you joining us for the live discussion.